Hi, everyone. I think we're just waiting for everyone to come in and settle. There's quite a, we had 134 RSVPs for today, so
157.
157 last count. That's awesome. So we're just waiting for a few people to come in. While we're doing that, I'll just note for everyone that we are recording. It allows us to circulate the presentation for anyone who wasn't able to make it. And I think what happens is sometimes the people who register are hoping that means they get the recording if they can't make it to the event. All right. Well, it looks like everyone who's coming early is in, so we might kick off. And I'd just like to welcome everybody to the Futures of Seafood December webinar. We have been doing some monthly updates as we go, but this is a very large, broad update that Angela and I'll present on the project to round out the year, I suppose, just to sort of recap on the intense year that it was around this project and show you where we're at. And hopefully by the end of today, you have a really good sense of where we have gotten to by the end of 2024 and potentially where we're headed in 2025. And I'd like to just take a moment to acknowledge that I'm dialing in from Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. So, and that's in Sydney, where I work and live. And I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging of these lands. And feel free to drop your where you're dialing in from in the chat. Thank you for that. And with the in terms of housekeeping, we plan to go for an hour. Ange and I will. Anyone who knows us, we do talk a lot, so we will try and leave some space at the end for questions. But please drop your questions in the chat. Please hold them to the end so that we can address them as we go. But we really encourage you to ask questions and interrogate this project as much as we can, because we know how important it is to industry, to other users of the resource and other stakeholders. So, and again, thank you for taking the time with us today. So Ange is controlling the slides, so we'll just go to the next slide. We'll share the slides, Ange, if that's okay. So you're not in presentation mode yet, so we can see sort of the things around it. If you want to just hit presentation mode down the bottom.
Yeah, this is going well.
This is going really well. That's okay. We're not known for our technological skills. That's okay. No one expects it. So just go back to slide 1. There we go. Look at you. Well done. Okay, so as I said, we're going to present an update on the Futures of Seafood project. If we just go to the next slide, Ange, I'll kick off. And we've still got people coming, so welcome to everyone coming in. So for those, most people online know us, but for those of you who don't, my name is Veronica Papacosta. I'm the CEO of Seafood Industry Australia, and Angela Williamson is my co-presenter today, and I would say principal lead of the project. We are co-leads. SIA and Blue Economy CRC are co-leads of the project, but I have to declare Ange has been doing a lot of the work. So, and I thank her as a project partner for that. So where we started, just briefly, just to set the scene, back in March 2002, the change of government led to quite a shifting gear around ocean access and ocean use, which saw a very clear increase in competition for ocean space. Very quickly, industry identified and SIA and Blue Economy put our heads together to understand that the real challenge around that is how do we understand the cumulative impacts of all the decisions that are being made in the ocean, and understanding that as the commercial industry and other resource users, we work across more than just the agriculture portfolio. We work across energy, environment, industry, and health in some ways. So how do we get a line of sight across all of those, the decisions being made in all those portfolios? How do we create a line of sight and a method of mapping and understanding the impacts of decisions and other factors that are influencing the ocean and therefore the Australian seafood industry, plus our recreational and our First Nations sector friends. So Futures of Seafood was developed around that. It also takes into account, as we'll talk a little bit more, around climate change, some things that we control, some things we don't control, but climate change emerging as a very serious impact on oceans. And I think for us, it was very important that the founders and the funders of this project that the Australian government was invested in this investigation and project. So Department of Agriculture, Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water, the FRDC and Blue Economy are co-funders. So we've had very good support, great support for the funding of the project, but also across the governance spectrum and involvement through the different jurisdictional committees, the project oversight committees. It has been a really well-resourced project and lots of interest, and started a huge amount of conversations. Some we hoped for, some we expected, but even more than we had hoped or expected. So we're feeling very confident that Futures is tracking really well. In terms of tracking, I will hand over to Angela for the next slide, and just to start taking us through some of the deliverables and where we're at in terms of what we hope to achieve with Futures and where we're at. So I will hand over to Angela.
Thank you so much, Veronica, and I really appreciate this opportunity. I think we all, majority of us kind of went through who had registered. We all met really early on with Futures of Seafood when we were putting in front of you quite an ambitious proposition. And we put forward this slide that had a whole series of activities. And I'm actually really excited to take you through it because I got to cross things out, which any project manager knows is a really exciting piece. So Futures of Seafood was always about packages of information that can be delivered over an 18-month period. And our starting point really sat around better understanding the state of play of seafood in Australia. So that was looking at social and economic values, and factors around the industry, looking at descriptions of the fisheries and the system itself, and then looking at impact timelines from 2002 to now. And understanding those trends, forecasts, and what are those cumulative impacts, positive and negative, that have played a role to where we are at the moment. Another really important piece was looking at securing a cultural navigator and a recreational navigator, and that work is still underway. And over the next couple of weeks to months, we're going to be in a position where there'll be more information around First Nations and around recreational activities as well, and fishing and what that looks like. To complement the work that we've already done around the commercial wild catch and commercial aquaculture space. But we do at the moment have data sets from every jurisdiction. I'll take you through what that looks like shortly. We have profiles on all the fisheries and aquaculture activities. We have profiles on gear, and we've been able to really, close out as much as we can at this stage of our state of play piece. And that's a really important contributor to the study, because even though we said we've got an 18-month period, each of these packages talks to the next package, to the next package, and that final package, which is our roadmap, our way forward, our what we want, what we don't want. There's also been a substantive amount of work, and I thank everyone who's not in seafood, but are ocean users or ocean managers who have taken time out over the last 6 or so months to join us in workshops and surveys and interviews and meetings to also talk about what's going on in their space and where they've come from, what today looks like, and looking ahead, but looking towards 2040 as well, so that we can start understanding what consequences of these actions could look like, and how are we better prepared as an industry, and how do we support the aspirations to grow, evolve, or optimise the seafood sector in Australia. And where we are at the moment, and we just held our jurisdictional and oversight committee meetings last week. There was like 8 meetings over 5 days, and it was actually really exciting. We'll take you through that in more detail as well, because it allowed us to calibrate what we're thinking, what our researchers and people that we've commissioned are thinking, against industry perspective and other ocean user and regulator perspective, as we sort of go through a bit of a calibration process. So I'll take you through that in more detail. But where we are at the moment, we've got clarity on those hot issues. We've got clarity on those drivers of change. We've got clarity as to where we are at the moment and sort of where we're heading. And so how we're going to spend this next 50 odd minutes, we'll be taking you through that in more detail. Before I get into those, I really wanted to just touch on the participation piece. And Veronica, from a Seafood Industry Australia perspective, you know, we've had, I think it's almost 500 individual voices that have been able to contribute through the workshops and the surveys and the interviews and the meetings. Do you want to take us through how that's felt for you and how that information has been able to help inform you with other work going on as well as futures?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to note the amount of engagement work that happened in Q2 and Q3 predominantly, and also a shout out. And we've had some changes to the Futures of Seafood team, and so just a shout out to Jessica McInerney and to Shane Roberts, who led a lot of that for the project in the early days. And that was it was such an engaged and a deep engagement that we see the benefits of a lot of that work coming through now. What you see on the page is just a snapshot of participation. So there is a lot more than that, and it's still building as the idea of futures and what we're trying to achieve. Oh, hi Jess, I didn't realise she was online. There you go. I did that even not knowing you were there. You know, we're still building on this. That what futures is become its own space for conversations around the ocean, around seafood, around fishing and aquaculture and First Nations and rec. So we are building on that. I just wanted to point out that that's just a snapshot participation list. And so we are through the workshop series, through the interviews and the surveys. I think the workshops going first, we got an opportunity just to map out generally from the participants in every jurisdiction those high level issues, the timelines. So we're creating this timeline of understanding in each jurisdiction of what are the turning points, what are the things that have really shaped the industry or the jurisdiction as we know it. And we know that that's government decisions, ministerial decisions, but also changing environmental needs, community needs. We know that it's different people. Like one of the things that came through that was really interesting is that it very much sometimes our industry can change on personality. You know, if someone puts a real effort into something, or there's a change of government, and there can be really interesting ebbs and flows, positive and negative. So we've really, as a team, SIA Blue Economy and the Futures team, really lived that, and it imprinted on us quite deeply the challenge that is ahead. And the challenge, the history that's come and the challenge that's ahead. And so through the interviews and the surveys, we've been able to deep dive on some of those issues and get right down to detail on it, which I think that has been really important for us to learn. And a lot of that you will see if you've seen the Seafood Industry Australia Seafood Leadership Package. Predominantly the purpose of that is for the federal election. But you will see a lot of elements of what we're understanding through futures coming through in that package. So I urge you to go and have a look at it. There's a lot more that will come out. I say to everyone, if I could find the remote control to pause on the federal election so we could finish futures, I would have, but I couldn't find the remote. So we've kind of had to develop and influence as we go, as futures develops and more issues and more detail comes to light. But the participation has been wonderful, and it is growing, which is really important for us to see. So Ange, I'll hand back to you for sort of some atlas and mapping stuff.
Yeah, thank you. I think you've really emphasised something that's so important about this study, and that was about providing a new table to have a conversation. But at the same time to be able to collect information that's already out there but put it together in a slightly different way. Some people look at futures and they think maps and data, and I'm not going to lie, it's a really crucial piece of the futures study, because we did outline we wanted to be evidence-based, and a large part of that evidence is showing trends of activity, what it looked like back in 2002, and then using aggregates of every 5 years to get to now to really understand what those changes in activity, in production, in where people are operating, what that looks like. So as I've touched on, we're in a position where we have, by able to collect those data sets and create those maps, we're in a position where we've got in the order of 1,000-ish maps over that time series for all the wild and aquaculture activities in Australia by jurisdiction. We are on the website. You'll be getting profiles and maps, so you'll be able to get a bit of a deep dive and understand what's going on. But the other thing that we've been doing alongside this is creating a more live portal where you can actually choose what you want to have a look at, dig in deeper, have a look at some combinations as well, and start moving towards the portal kind of concept that many people have been looking for and asking for. I'm not going to lie, there are other portals out there at the moment. This is looking to provide our data to those as well, non-confidential data, of course. But we've certainly created a portal that comes from a seafood industry perspective. So that central piece really is user development, industry perspective. And then we're looking at other ocean users, environmental values, including capturing what's happening in climate change and shifts and adaptation pieces, but also your social values and governance measures. So we're looking at it from an ESG/D or ESD perspective, and really trying to get a beautiful balance in creating and collecting and demonstrating this information for our users. As I touched on, profiles are a really important piece as well. And this builds on the work that FRDC have done through SAFs, through some of the jurisdictions have. But what we really wanted was an industry-led seafood profile that articulates really important aspects of telling the story of the fishery or aquaculture activity, of the gear types from a risk perspective, to be able to show adaptation and innovation, talking about supply chain, and we're in the process as well of creating recreational profiles and First Nation cultural profiles too. We have also got profiles on other ocean users and other ocean management approaches, such as marine protected areas and things along those lines as well. These profiles will be able to be downloaded, and I use the crab one as an example. So that it's also part of our literacy piece more broadly. So it has an important education kind of element, but it also can be used by interested persons who are wanting to understand not just the movement and shifts and trends from a data perspective, but also what are some of the other considerations for that fishery and those individuals in there, and allows us to celebrate what's going well, and at the same time look at some of those things that are shared across multiple fisheries that can be scaled up or adjusted further. So data's, and then the profiles, consider that the atlas and the encyclopedia. But one of those other pieces, and I saw that we've got Abby on board from BDO. Hi, Abby. Wanted to do a big shout out and thanks for the work that you and Anders and the team are doing. And I might pass this one over to Veronica, because this is one of those iconic pieces of futures that we're looking to turn into a standard routine disclosure sort of opportunity in continually telling the story of seafood. And this is one very close to Veronica's heart.
Right. Thanks, Ange. But before I do, I'm just going to, I've got Sarah dropping these slides into the chat because I'm seeing some chatter that not everyone can see the slides. So we will drop them into the chat. You can open them on your own computer and everyone can have a copy of them. They can play along at home. But you've got audio, which is the important part. And there will be a recording post the presentation. Okay, so seafood flow. So those of you who know me, I'm a third-generation retailer. The consumption of seafood domestically is very important to me. The importance of that transition between the production of seafood, whether it's from any of the sectors, but we produce seafood and food from the ocean. And at some point, it lands on people's plates. They engage with it. It creates food memories. I think it's a really important piece for the Australian community. And part of what Futures of Seafood was really about was making sure we understand the commitment to the Australian community around accessing their Australian seafood. And so one of the levers of that, one of the things that we had never been able to comprehensively map is where seafood is produced. We have a lot of data. I know that it's data hell and there are gaps, but there is a lot of data around that, but not as much data in post-harvest. So it was very much a commitment of Futures to create a map that showed where seafood flows, the economic contribution of different states across Australia, where it's being eaten, if possible. So whether it's at home in food service, thinking about country of origin labelling and everything we know about the importance of that legislation change coming in July. So the task handed to BDO was comprehensive. They have done a lot of work. They've got a lot of skill in that team around. They've done some work in sectors or jurisdictions, but this is this whole comprehensive map. And I will say that it has been quite hard to secure the data that we need. I think part of the learning of this will be what we need to do better. So where we need to improve, and potentially where industry, when they see the value of what we can create, even with the data set that we've been able to secure, I'm hoping that will make industry and other post-harvest more interested in sharing some of the data that they have, so we can keep improving these maps. But we are really impressed with what BDO has been able to do with what they've got. And that is data from the retail sector. I've put my data from my business and different areas of Sydney fish markets have been very generous in providing data around this. That we're building the best map that we can for now. And I still think there'll be a lot of value, and you'll see that economic contribution from different jurisdictions. But we will identify the gaps as we can and keep working to improve this. I think in some of the earlier elements of the project, we did talk about the idea that the implication of government policies, the implication of decisions around seafood at the state level has impact on the amount of seafood available, and that's very important to the Australian community, and needs to be, and really leverages off the idea that 64% of what we're eating currently is imported. And we need to keep that. We need to push that back to 50 if we can, but we definitely need to avoid getting to 90% like the US. And so this kind of data set and these efforts that we're doing here is about contributing to that information piece. So I do feel really strongly about it. I can talk about it a lot more, but I won't. I will hand back to Ange on the next piece.
No, thank you so much. And I think definitely one of the pieces to this is when I was going through the atlases, and thank you everyone for their data contributions, that was because in some cases I had actually given jurisdictions 2 weeks to give us 24 years worth of data in a particular format. And so we talk about data hell in this particular project, but we know that we've walked into something that a number of other people have dealt with or are dealing with, and it's great to be alongside other survivors of data hell. But we are really confident that we can use futures to capture those limitations, as Veronica has talked about, and look at how we can feed those into formats around like AFMEF and some of their data working groups, some of the work that FRDC is doing already, and how futures can help contribute to other things that are happening at the same time, which I think is going to be really important, because that's how it becomes useful beyond the project. I might just go through the insights, Veronica, and then we can move to scenarios, and I'll pass over to you. But as I touched on, there are really critical inputs at the moment into futures, and work packages 1 and 2 was collecting the data sets and mapping it. It was collecting profiles and insights into the various fishery activity and aquaculture activities, but we were also capturing those impact timelines. We were working on the nutritional story. We were really trying to better understand barriers and opportunities around investors, regulatory, market, sustainability, climate and nature, profiling governance in each jurisdiction, and requested information from those jurisdictions to understand how they govern wild, how they govern aquaculture, to identify either things that can be scaled up or areas of caution moving forward. We've undertaken, and thanks to the team at Sativis, we've undertaken some really amazing analysis off the back of those workshops and surveys and interviews. That's where in the order of like almost 300-400 people have contributed in that space, and they've created these insight reports around what we heard. We also were able to work with the peak bodies to better understand what have they already been saying over the last 5 years, what have been their contribution to the current conversations. So we've been able to analyse that and feed that as well into our outputs that you'll be seeing over the coming month or so as we start turning this into those products on our website. undertaken multiple use case studies. One of the really important pieces, as we touched on earlier, was that cumulative element. So looking at multiple users in the same space and how they have navigated change or intersection. And then in the process now of doing 15 hot issue case studies, and that comes off the back of those insight reports and analysis, looking at the hot issues in all the jurisdictions and understanding what's shared and what might be separate, but how do we dig deeper? We've heard this, we've now analysed this, and we've got a deep dive into better understanding this issue. We've got quotes and background and regulatory basis, and we're able to use that to move towards, well, what are these scenarios and what are these actions moving forward? Which moves us to a large part of today's conversation, and I'll pop this over to Veronica. But this is the scenarios, this is those cumulative impact pieces, and we're really fortunate to be working with CSIRO and able to draw on their many years of work more broadly in this space, but get them to do something different, looking different from a different perspective, and that's an industry-led perspective. Over to you, V.
Yeah, the scenario, it's fair to say that the scenario modelling pieces that we shared with the jurisdictional committees and anyone who's in the meeting that's on the jurisdictional committee, we went into a lot more detail in those committee meetings because Beth Fulton's team put out some initial viewpoints and ideas around what they took out of the workshop. So the first workshop underpinning the scenario modelling was held at Seafood Directions in Hobart in September. We expected about 30 people to come to those workshops. I think we were overprescribed by, I think it was about 150 people, and we ended up having 2 sessions. So that was fantastic. And so what we got to do with the scenarios was look at different timeframes, so 20 to 2025, 2025 to 2030, these different timeframes, and actually have a look at how, if we change nothing, what our trajectory looks like. If we make some real changes with government and stakeholders in a unified way, what changes, improvements and preferred outcomes we can have in the ocean space, and what happens if we don't work together and we don't make good changes and climate change bites hard. So the scenario modelling work is just getting started, but we did present to the jurisdictional committees some of the initial ideas that were coming out that were picked directly up off those workshops. And it's fair to say that this is really where the rubber hits the road in terms of playing out what we want for the ocean, what our risk profile is, what our expectation is for the community and for our different sectors. And it definitely caused lots of conversation. So I have to say, watching how Beth and her team have worked has been really impressive. I have a newfound respect. But still, the scenario modelling world is it's wild. It's still a little bit beyond my pay grade, but it has been fantastic to watch, and I think it's a really important part of the project now that a lot of the mapping is done, and I think, Ange, it's 1,300 maps have been created. Building off that information database, we now have a place where we can start playing with the scenarios, and I think from the beginning we've identified that this is really where tough conversations need to happen, where we need to question the motives and approaches of everyone involved in the ocean and how we improve it. And I think Ange is going to run you through some of the drivers of opportunities and challenges in the next slides. But I think there is some information going back out to the jurisdictional committees around that initial work that will help really fine-tune what we're looking to do. And I believe that there is a roadshow happening around scenario modelling that everyone should really look out for in February, March of next year. Ange, is that right?
Yeah, so the way that Beth's model, and oh my gosh, I'm not a modeler, but all of these inputs go in, and then January is model running month. And so we'll be using these attributes, these drivers of change to develop out these different scenarios. These scenarios, some are national, some are jurisdictional. And then come February, March, there'll be a roadshow where the people that we got together earlier this year will be brought back together with a great, thanks, this is what you provided, this is how it's being used, what do we think? And that's a really important piece because we start to scrutinise what these scenarios look like and what they're saying. We make them more bespoke for what are some of the live issues of the day. And then we're able to identify, because the scenarios aren't about this is the future and we can't do anything about it. These scenarios are about identifying areas where the future might not align with what we want, or and so what actions or interventions do we need to take or put forward through futures and the roadmap? Or alternatively, what things do we like? And so we want to, really emphasize those. So how do we achieve that? And so the last part, that work package 4, really is what do we need to do? What do collectively people need to do? Who needs to do what, to move from where we have been, not understanding where we could be, but focused on where do we want to be. And that's a really critical piece. And it's a bit, it's quite inner looking in a way, because it's understanding, as well as you said, what people's thresholds are, what people are willing to accept or not accept, and then therefore how do we work together to move forward.
And I will just highlight, because I think it's important, this project, and especially the scenario modelling, is very grounded in industry. So we've had so much support and connection to industry, which is not always easy. Everyone's busy, but it has had a lot of support. And I think there's a recognition there that this is how we make real change, by playing out the scenarios and getting our brains to think that way. Beth's got a great presentation on how our brains work compared to how we need them to work to make these changes. So looking forward to that and watching out for her team. And I think the speed that the Futures project team has been moving at, plus overlaying it with that industry engagement, has been really impressive. So I think it's important to shout that out.
Absolutely. When Futures was being designed, and Veronica and I sat down with Beth in the margins of a Blue Economy CRC participants workshop back in the day, I think that it was really quite empowering when we put something forward and Beth goes, I know how to do that. I actually have a way of achieving that. We sort of talked about what that end point was. And part of that as well is understanding those drivers of change from an opportunity perspective. So the way that this piece has been really identified or divvied up, it sits around understanding values, improved profitability, economic resilience and innovation, and governance structures, for example, when you're looking at those opportunities. And that's really aligned with what was heard in those workshops, and it ranges from things that are already in play or have a commitment, such as a country of origin labelling, circular economy, species diversification and new species, but also things that are in development, but we haven't quite seen what that impact is, such as sustainable ocean plan, nature repair market, regenerative restorative practices more broadly. And then when it comes to the challenges, again, this is just a very short piece, and we will be circulating more information to our jurisdictional committees. We just have to make some adjustments to some of the language to get some of the context right. But that really sits around, again, a real piece around that climate change element, those global economic pressures, costs of operations, the politicisation of the debate, the rapid rate of change, and the inertia and resistance to change and things along those lines, and gear technology adjustments and risk profiling, which is clearly been front of mind for many people given what's been going on more broadly in Australia. So I'm just going to move now into, well, what are we going to do with all of this information? And as I touched on earlier, there's that piece about what if these scenarios provide a future that is not what industry is looking for? So what needs to be done? What needs to be harnessed? And that's where in Work Package 4, the roadmap really plays an important role. So we're going through the process of starting to compile information to feed into this roadmap piece at the same time of watching, and we'll be incorporating what comes through this scenario element. But this is around recommendations of actions or campaigns that address those hot issues that we touched on. The hot issues pretty much cover governance and policy, that research and innovation, consumers and market, and growth and investment. And we're looking at how to map action and transition planning, including future funding opportunities. Looking at delivering a national industry-wide impact statement, so starting to look at what Australia's regulatory impact statements look like, but also other countries as well, and looking at how to better tell that story and what some of those metrics could look like moving forward. And then what we touched on earlier around the mapping and some of the data, the collection that we're doing, how do we turn this into routine disclosure and legacy in the knowledge and data products? What could that look like? So there's a series of conversations that have really started, and some of these have been happening in other projects, and we play a role in those as well as an additional voice, connecting what we've found through futures into these spaces or vice versa. But at the same time, you know, with those hot issues that have been identified, there's a series, I call them the good, the bad, and the ugly. They're those ones that are opportunities. There are the bad that have, you know, quite negative impacts, and then the ugly, which are like those extinction level event sort of style policy actions or directions that are really, you know, quite have those kinds of consequences. When you're also looking at those hot issues, there's a real focus on policy and regulatory action, but at the same time, resource access and rights, conflict resolutions, safeguards, guarantees. In the context of industry and where they are today and where they want to be tomorrow, we've been using the maintenance, optimization, growth and evolution kind of quadrant and looking at what's needed to help support industry move through those depending on where they're at. And then equally looking at what are those governance regimes in place, and are they around maintaining an industry, or are they about growing? And if not, how can we provide some ways forward on that? And it's been interesting because off the back of this, we've had sectors come up to us and fisheries and say, listen, we want to have optimization conversations. Can you take us through what that could look like and how we can do that in a safe space? And so the rules of engagement or tactical guides or playbooks is something that's really coming to mind as well as we start to work through that. Touched on that data legacy piece. Consumer and community awareness is one of those hot issues. It was consistent across all those jurisdictional activities that we did about how to better tell our story, how to be better valued by the Australian consumers and community and politicians as well. I touched on some of those major studies that are out there at the moment that are really prominent, that FRDC or Blue Economy or others have covered all their studies that Blue Economy, Seafood Industry Australia, peak bodies and FRDC are working on, like decarbonisation. And then parallel to Futures of Seafood, you've had one of Australia's like most pivotal, or the potential to be the most pivotal kind of guide for ocean use with the Sustainable Ocean Plan finalisation. And Veronica has touched on that seafood leadership package already. So off the back of where we are at the moment, we're starting January and February is really focused on starting to explore those the vision that we kind of create, the synthesis, the scenarios, and looking at those action plans or campaigns. And they range from rebalance, so balancing ocean use and conservation. And this is much broader than seafood more broadly. And so Seafood Industry Australia and Blue Economy have been working with other ocean users about how we can look to sort of reshape that policy or regulatory or risk-based kind of environment, what that looks like. A guarantee, how do we provide an Australian seafood guarantee? I'll touch on that in a moment. Optimization, what does research and innovation reset? How can we be more attuned to those industry-led initiatives? What else is happening around the world and other proteins and ag, and how do we better optimize and attract investment that makes sense for industry? Recognizing there are all these amazing kind of activities out there and institutions that all have different funding approaches and tenure timeframes. So how do we make sense of that old spaghetti? Amplification, there was a real push, as I touched on earlier, around consumer and community trust. So what can we do to build and amplify that? What does that look like as a sector, as a collective? And then that rapid response piece, those tactical guides, the playbooks on those hot issues. How do we learn from what's taken place, and how do we better see around the corners, noting what has been experienced and what does that look like? So with those in mind, for example, I'm just going to touch on the concept of an Australian seafood guarantee, for example, that is looking at addressing centralisation and unity, future-proofing, innovation, security, growth, investment. We've been able to draw from everyone who's touched on this through the workshops, the surveys, the interviews, jurisdictional committees, our oversight committee, our report card coordination, the leadership package, but also looking at what's going on around the world. And so, understanding what's been motivating or driving safeguards or other initiatives. And then expert and practitioner perspectives. The CFA hosted a workshop, the FRDC hosted a participants workshop, and this was these kinds of concepts were discussed. And FRDC has also been funding a series of projects that have sort of been looking at bits and pieces around this space. And then the sustainable ocean planning process. So some of these next steps with these campaigns is around creating bespoke think tanks with multidisciplinary experts to start looking into those across the different areas of commercial wild. So pig body companies, aquaculture, rec fishing, retail, supply chain research, and the government regulator space. So for this one, it's looking at the legal framework and alignment with UNCLOS, but also being really aware of the nature positive piece that's coming through. So the CBD impact. Looking at a seafood balance sheet, so understanding all the different users and contributors, and looking at some unity, what that could potentially look like if you are recreation, First Nations and commercial, and if you're a regulator. So components around that, investor certainty and market stability, safeguarding, as I touched on, your domestic industries, given the import proposition and what safeguards could look like in that space, comprehensive ocean user rights systems, which have been explored over time, but there is certainly a live conversation as new and emerging users coming to the oceans that they're also looking at what this could mean. Consumer awareness and support, and that accountability and monitoring towards any kind of activity. So this is preliminary thinking. There's processes around how people can participate in this, and then we'll be looking to socialise these as well in that February-March period where we go through those workshops and activities around Australia with our stakeholders. Veronica, before I go into some other pieces, did you want to add?
Ange, I was going to say, I'll give you a voice of rest for a second.
Yeah.
Look, the campaigns and the playbooks are incredibly important parts of the project. I think I've said that about every part of the project. I think it's all really important. But one thing I just did want to touch on, Angie's explanation there, is we are developing ideas as we go, noting that the recreational and Indigenous navigators are it's probably like the different parts of the project are happening at different times. So if some of those campaigns look very commercial focused, we're aware of that. We will build in and develop as we go through and get more out of our recreational and Indigenous navigators feeding back into the project. So I just wanted to make that clear, because we do want to accommodate our sector friends and also other ocean users. So it is looking quite commercial, because that's obviously where a lot of the data has been held and a lot of the early work has been done.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm really looking forward to, as we get our input from our navigators, they've been also encouraged to look for aspirations and come up with these concepts as well. So that list will get bigger as we move forward, and that will be looking at, some really important aspects as well. So I'm not preempting what they are at this stage, which I think is a really important point, B.
Yeah. So you've got some summer reading here, Ange.
This is homework for everyone. They're going to be tested in February. No, the development of the Australian seafood scape has been like a really pivotal early contributor to Futures of Seafood. This is a nutritional story around well-being, and it's actually now become a bit of a template, and we've got a number of countries around the world who are looking off the back of a recent FAO meeting to follow suit and do something like this as well. So it's great when Australia is a leader, and certainly looking to give you an early Christmas present or a summer reading document moving forward. And that's going to be part of how Futures is going to be delivering over this next couple of weeks to Jan. There's going to be deliverables through our website, which looks like this. And And it's our main platform of circulating information. So we don't just wait till the end of the 18 months and go to here's a report at the end. Futures was certainly also built around creating ongoing communications, access to material, and ability to link to other activities and material as well from that perspective. I'm going to stop sharing.
Right. Okay. Well, and I think on that last page we flicked off, there was I think a broader list of the contributors. And if we miss anyone, then we will rectify that before the end of the project. But there have been so many contributors. I think it's 26 contractors.
26 contractors, approximately 80 contributors at this point. And then you add the CSIRO contribution of staff. They've got teams for every jurisdiction doing their modelling as well. So it's quite significant.
And as I said, our Futures of Seafood and Blue Economy and SIA teams, thank you very much for your engagement and contribution to date. It's been a big job. So it's 12:45, so we've left some time for questions. If anyone would like to put their hand up and ask a question, we will do our best to answer it or take it offline. So are there any questions or comments that anyone would like to come forward with? Keith, you've turned your camera on. Does that mean you're about to ask a question? Just
It does, Veronica. It's one that's tremendous amount of work that's been done, and really looking at the outputs, looks like it really is going to have some meaningful opportunities for change when it comes to seafood going forward. The one thing that sort of sat in the background for me, and you touched on it a bit at the end, even that sort of dealing with the between sector, within sector conflict or change, and she talked about it a little bit as well in terms of tools to use. It feels like if we haven't had the engagement of the rec sector, and I know they've been involved, but if we haven't had the engagement of the rec sector and the traditional sector, we're a long way down the track to try and implement or come back into it. It's the one sort of negative I can see. The rest of it, for me, all feels like it's moving in a great direction and doing it that way. But we all know those challenges that come up at different times, and it feels like trying to sort of dovetail it in at the end is one thing. So I'm just interested if there's a bit more of a plan of how to do it. You mentioned it a little bit, but in terms of that side of it, because we all have those challenges within our jurisdictions and across our jurisdictions in terms of that space.
And look, I would say it's the end of the year, but not the end of the project. And you're right, we've materially progressed through the information and data we had. But we have taken an approach of staying open when it gets to that sort of scenario and campaign area. But the work packages 1 and 2, it is what it is. There's no doubt that the engagement with the recreational sector, particularly, we needed to be really respectful of the fact that this project for them felt like a project for the commercial sector. And so we needed to really listen to their concerns around that and work through that. And I don't think pushing them onto the project earlier without listening and really understanding those concerns would have been a mistake. And so we did take our time to understand it, and we did. And look, there is always, I would say, there is always a divide between some of the engagement we have at that sort of national representative level and some things that are happening on the ground. And that is something that we need to navigate better as sectors. But we are really committed to making sure that when that navigator work comes in, it is included. And I've committed personally to that we will include that information. We won't get better outcomes on the ground with other sectors if we don't encourage and accommodate and listen and learn both ways. But I might just hand to Ange to sort of answer more from a technical perspective of the project.
Yeah, it's a really important point, and it's probably looks a little behind the scenes as well, because we've ensured that on our committees and our governance arrangements, our invitations to all the activities to date have been open, and we've had representatives, which has been excellent. The bit that we're really focused on is, we've got our first cultural navigator report that's been provided, so that's fed in, even though it's still in finalisation. has been about like January, February, March, April, May, June is what I call calibrate conversation time. We have an advantage because we have data in front of us. But then the conversations, there is so much space for that, for that's that next piece. And that's where the evidence kind of element comes in. So in the case of our cultural navigator, we've got a report and we have a series of interviews that are still to take place. And then that feeds into this next piece. And in the case of our recreational navigator, we've given them, I call it the freedom within boundaries. Here are some high levels that we're after, and here are some timeframes to deliver those so that they don't get lost along the way. And over to them to go and just as commercial has been able to achieve, be able to have those deep conversations about what's working and what's not, because that's really what a lot of futures insights have been. The data piece is a bit different. We do actually have data for First Nations and recreational to an extent, but straight away there are so many limitations, and so straight away that becomes part of their question. This is what we've got. What else is out there? What are your thoughts on these? How do you contribute into this space? And there are questions there for government and research as well in that space.
Yeah, I mean, I think at a really high level, and I think that was a good point you made before, V, about the fact that when you get into the nitty gritty, you sometimes get into these challenges, but at a really high level, I think there's a huge amount of commonality, and that's the positive part of it. And in fact, until it's unpacked, I think people don't realise how much commonality there is in this space. And so I think that's fine. And your explanation there shows about sort of transitioning through, and it's ongoing. It doesn't end, and that's it in terms of that side of it. So yeah, that's fine. That sounds good.
The interesting, Keith, the fish, and thanks for the question. It's a really good one. The fish balance, the seafood balance sheet that we talk about, when we've engaged on that, we talk about the basis is sustainability, and I haven't found anyone who doesn't have a commitment to making sure fish are okay. And so there's really solid basis that we need to work from, and we just, in many respects, I think we'd have to, from maybe the national perspective, just improve those communication lines. And it will take a bit more time on the ground, I think. Yeah. Thanks, Keith.
Thanks, Keith.
Any other questions or comments? Otherwise, we're happy to wrap it up and give everybody some time back. Just waiting for anyone who's fumbling for their mouse to put their hand up. No? Okay. Oh, there we go.
Oscar.
See? They always wait a little bit longer. Hi, Oscar.
My only question is in terms of usable data. So there's a couple of stories that look like they're coming out that look really useful, kind of sharing the good news with people. And that's one thing that we've been doing with Blue Carbon, and I really want to get into it. So I'm just wondering, in terms of data and things that you can share, and sort of things like we eat a lot more seafood than the Americans do, and because we're patriotic prawn eaters. Is that kind of thing going to be a regular? And when can we get a good chunk of it that we can tell the story about how awesome our seafood is?
Oscar, that's a great one. Yeah. So the seafood scape becomes like, and I'm ex-comms, I still pretend I'm comms, as you know. And so for me, this just gives us the best message bank possible, and consider it a baseline of data and knowledge. Our intention is to be able to, through this, also make recommendations on turning this into routine. And so what is that regular collection, disclosure and usage look like, which is a really important part of futures as well. So rather than every 20 years or digging through a million sort of resources, how do we move into a more routine disclosure space so that that can be used? So one of the cool things about the website is we will be looking at how we can share comms messages as well, and comms packs off the back of that. This was part of, what we put forward for funding, was around how do you create those message banks, and how can seafood stakeholders use them and draw from them in their own work as well, and referenced.
And I will just only add to that again, the gaps that we have found are also really important information. Yeah. So where it is that there's information that we don't have, what do we think the value of collecting that? What's the cost benefit analysis of collecting that information? So those areas will be really interesting to unpack, Oscar.
Fantastic. Okay. And obviously we'll share any data that we pick up as we go along.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Craig. Oh, you're on mute, Craig.
This might be a bit of PTSD
That's
because
okay.
we've just gone through the South Coast Marine Park process. But one of the lines that was drawn by government is the difference between healthy marine environments, which support biodiversity, and the broader fisheries sustainability. On page 11, most of the values, they seem to be a lot about us as an industry, including sustainability. But we might want to consider having something in there about supporting environmental diversity and enrichment, or something similar to that. It's picked up to some extent on page 15 under the rebalance, but page 14 sort of, I think there's a gap there. It might be just something to consider, that's all.
That's great, Craig. I think that's certainly something that's been raised. And I think it's just fallen out because this is an abbreviation, but absolutely, I'll make sure it gets back in that top line. I think that's an important, and I think your learnings and the PTSD element is real. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Acknowledge that. Thank you, Craig.
Definitely acknowledge that.
Anyone else that wants to make a comment or ask a question? Otherwise, we might start wrapping it up. Ange, do you have any final thoughts or comments you wanted to share?
I think my initial one really is just a thank you for everyone. As I touched on, there was so many contributions and it continues to contribute. And even the points by Oscar and Craig and Keith are, keeping us honest and on our toes. And I think that's a really important part of this project. And I also greatly value the fact that I hate the word, but we're on a bit of a journey, and the ability to go through an evidence-based continuous kind of check-in calibration piece, I think is going to mean hopefully that this investment is so much broader than just what the deliverables are that we are coming up with, that it's actually a way of working. And my hope as well is at the conclusion of this, and as we start next year's piece, that people start thinking about how to turn this into something of their own as well, and how does that fit within your work and what you're doing more broadly, because that's what will make it successful and keep it alive.
Yeah. And I think, thank you, Ange. And I think for me and for SIA, we just acknowledge that we're in December. We're all about to start planning Christmas with our families. So I will again encourage you to go out and buy some Australian seafood. I think one thing that has come through off the back of Craig's comment as well is that the industry is in a particular place and it's not easy. It's tough out there. It's tough for some of our largest sectors. It's incredibly tough for some of our smaller fishers as well. So we do think of them and hope that everyone stays safe over the Christmas break. And again, we can talk a lot about maps and have great pictures and colours, but these are really tough conversations, and we really want to get back into it early next year and start putting some rubber on the road and making sure that we're hearing it. So in project land, it's really nice to tick boxes and say that we're delivering, but in reality, this project must move the dial for the Australian seafood industry and our friends in Rec and First Nations. So we will keep on that mission. And thank you very much for your time. And I'll wrap up the meeting now and wish you a good day and a Merry Christmas. Thank you.